I refer to it now as an educational industry, because it now has become a system or a process by which we just push people through. We encourage belief. We encourage people to believe in something that we're going to present to them, not to think about it, not to have discussions about it. We don't, whether it's mathematics, whether it's history, whether it's English, by encouraging people to think critically, to debate, to be creative with it, we encourage better learning, but we also encourage them then later on to be able to interpret information and to continue to learn in that subject.
Welcome to High Performance Hockey Podcast. Today we're joined by performance coach, business advisor, Fergus Connolly, who spent a lifetime in high performance sport, physical therapist, strength coach, and business owner at Resilient Performance Training Systems, Doug Kechijian. Gentlemen, welcome to the High Performance Hockey Podcast. The impetus for this conversation really stemmed from a podcast episode that Doug had given, the Resilient Performance Podcast, and we'll link this to the show notes. And in it, Doug beautifully described what science is and what science isn't. In this particular context, we were talking about socioeconomic, policy, economics, etc. But I wanted to have more of a narrow, rifle-like approach to our conversation today and get more refined as our conversation evolves into sports science. So a couple of quotes that really stood out that Doug hit on were, social media-induced tribalism and the polarization of political discourse has reduced science to a hashtag and a form of signaling. The term science seems to have lost its meaning. Second quote, unlike a controlled experiment performed under lab conditions, the process of science does not live in a vacuum. Data collection and analysis intersect with human behavior, socio-political factors, and technology, which I think is beautifully illustrated, beautifully worded. And I think it parallels congruent with sports science. So why does any of this matter? Why does it matter to any of us? Well, to me, we as coaches, we're scientists, exercise scientists. The former without the latter may be a mindless pursuit. And although none of us are scientists by academics or conventional description, we all are scientists to some degree. Therefore, I think it's important for us to understand what science is, what science isn't, its limitations and its applications. So that's the impetus of today's conversation, and we'll get more and more involved and refined into what sports science is as well. But I wanted to reel it in, starting with you, Doug, if you could, from a general standpoint. What is science and what isn't science?
Great question. Tough question, because there's the ideal of science and then there's how it's actually applied. And I think it's an important question, but like to take a step back, you have to ask yourself, like, well, who cares, right? Because it's just a word, but words are important because there are certain assumptions behind words, and we want to speak a common language. And, if we establish this is what science is, then we have a place from which to start a conversation. But in reality, it's like, it doesn't matter. I think that, and you alluded to this from the quote you read, I think now what science has sort of become in this political environment is somebody says, well, I'm following the science. And it's kind of a way to absolve themselves of responsibility for what they're about to say. Because when you say, this is the science, well, science doesn't actually say anything. Like, people are messengers for science, for the scientific process, but science doesn't actually tell you what to do. So when people say, like, this is what the science says, no, like, this is what you're saying. Science actually says nothing. Science, where the process of science just gathers information, and then it's up to human beings to determine what to do with that information. So I would say, like, again, this is not like maybe the dictionary definition, but I think that what science is meant to be, it's a process of deriving information that's somewhat free of human perceptual biases and human errors. In other words, like, how can we gather data independent of our personal experiences? Because when we have personal experiences and we say, well, something works because I've seen it work, we can deceive ourselves. So the idea of the scientific process is, how can we, to the extent possible, it's impossible to totally remove the human element from data collection, but how can we collect data in the most unbiased way possible, so that at the end of our collection process, we have information that we can apply in some way. Now, the interesting part of the science is, let's say that, science is this very rigorous, systematic process of data collection. Well, once you have that data, you have to apply the data, and that's where, like, you can't separate the human element from the process of data collection or the scientific process, because I know this is not the direction you want to go in. This is more of like a thought exercise. If you look at COVID, right, like, everybody has access to the same data, and different states are doing different things from a policy standpoint. Different countries are doing different things from a policy standpoint. So policy is data or science plus your values, your ethics, and what you determine to be, sound risk mitigation, because there's always trade-offs when you're applying data, and there's always trade-offs with policy. So when people say, like, well, this is the scientific policy, there's really no such thing, because assuming that data is collected in good faith and it's being interpreted in good faith, which that's a very big assumption, because I don't think that actually happens.
Big assumption.
I'm very cynical about it, but let's assume those things are happening. Well, what underlying values do you have? And then what risk do you deem acceptable? Because that's going to dictate how you apply that data, or how you apply the findings from that scientific process. So I think that's, science is the process of data collection performed rigorously, but then how do you separate that from the interpretation and the human element? Because values and how we do cost benefit analyses, those are human processes that are kind of like contingent upon some form of consensus. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I think that's a good starting point.
Absolutely. Fergus, anything to add on to that?
No, I love some of love all of the points that Doug mentioned, but in particular, the whole perspective of bias, because ultimately, we rely on the scientific process to remove our personal biases or halo biases, whatever they are, so that we can come to a truth. And then you've got the whole application side of it. But the real reason for having a scientific process is to eliminate those biases or assumptions that we may have initially, because we come with a problem, or we come with a challenge that we're trying to either refine a little bit more, find a little bit more truth. And having a scientific approach allows us to remove those biases. Then you end up with a conclusion or conclusions that can be interpreted in so many different ways. Which is what Doug's mentioning, talking about, okay, well, now you've got conclusions, now you have to apply it. And the application in the real world then involves so many different things, where it's emotions, politics, trade-offs, financial benefits. And it's not just in this current, political climate or, pandemic climate. You have so much politics, for example, in sport as well. It's a highly politicized environment. There's a lot of fear, there's a lot of risk. And so they are the very same things that are affecting the decision-making in terms of how are we going to apply this. But ultimately, at the end of the day, I really think it comes down to what is the actual outcome that you as a group want to achieve, whether that's in a sporting context or in a societal environment.
Great. I think it was beautifully stated to me by one of my mentors, or not mentors, but philosopher and teacher, Karl Popper, one of the teachers I really respect. Science may be described as the systemic art of oversimplification. We don't prove here. We just lead to a better theory. I know you touched...
Anthony, his follow-on from that is it's really about deciding what we can dispel with,
Sure.
What we can, as Doug mentioned, trade off.
Sure.
It's okay. Because in order to simplify, we have to decide what is or is not important. And that is the art. That's okay. This is what, the science tells us. In order to simplify it and to apply it, we have to make trade-offs. We have to decide how we're going to. And that's the beauty of, and that's where the art of applying the science comes in.
And to piggyback, because I love what Fergus said about, we're trying to eliminate bias, but oftentimes, like, randomized controls trials are like synonymous with the scientific process. And I think that's an oversimplification. But what a randomized control trial does is you randomize somebody to a group, right? So, and then you also blind people to an intervention. Again, the idea behind that is to, mitigate the potential for bias. But there's always bias, even in a randomized control trial, because by virtue of the fact that you're asking a question, that implies some kind of a bias. It's not bad, but the fact that you care about the answer to a question, there's a human value behind why you care about the question. The process is always inherently human, no matter how objective you try to make it, because you have to start from somewhere, and a human being has to generate a question that is kind of like philosophically important, right? And so that's why even this whole thing with science and philosophy, where does one end and the other begin? It's a continuum. I think it's good to put things into buckets so we can try to say, okay, like now we're doing science, let's try to minimize bias, but you always have bias because you have to start from somewhere. And that question is sort of reflective of the things that you care about.
Sure.
Let me just keep going on that point as well. There's two other things I think. So even when, so you start the study, then even how you write it and present it, of course, now you've got biases. But then, so that's the scientific paper or the report. Then when you watch how certain papers, studies, or results are described in perhaps the public media or in, I'm going to use the word simpler, but it's not quite accurate, in more available medias, then you start to see emotional language being used. And that just changes the whole dynamic, the whole trajectory, and starts to introduce more and more biases. So, ultimately, I think the only cure for this truly is education. And, that's like turkeys voting for Thanksgiving. But what I mean is, what I mean is to encourage, but to encourage more critical thinking,
of course,
in our education system and in our youth, so that, as we continue to read things, we don't take things at face value, whether they are in the public domain or whether they are scientific papers.
And we don't even have the abilities. I say we don't. As sports scientists, most of our research is going to be observational in nature. There's no RTCs, right? It's we're looking at cohort studies, perspective, or retrospective studies where we can have even more confounders and more bias. So it's even more difficult to distinguish, quote unquote, good science. We've talked a little bit about this, but what are limitations to science? And I know we've talked about them before, but I want to pinpoint on one. Once again, I'm coming back to Karl Popper. He said a scientific discovery cannot be tested. A scientific result, cannot be proven. It can only be criticized and tested. This idea of criticism. This is something I believe we should embrace. This is the whole scientific method. This is iteration at its best. Why is it? I'm sure ego's involved in here, but do you guys see these limitations as well in terms and measures of proving a hypothesis as opposed to poking holes in ideas and trying to refute things?
Before I answer that question, I just want to make one distinction as well between science and academic research. Because I think that's important. I think there's this, automatic association that academia is the only place that science is, exists or is being done. And that's not true. And particularly when you look back in history, you look back at some of the great, either so-called scientists, whether it's Edison or whoever, they're working in their lab, which if you, go and see at the Henry Ford Museum, it's not doesn't resemble a lab. So but the idea that science only exists in the academic world, I think can be dangerous. But for me personally, I want and thrive on criticism. Both you and I, Ant, have shared documents, and I've probably said it to you, or I've put it in writing, like, break this for me. I want, because I know that nothing that I believe at this moment in time is perfect. And I always have to keep refining it, trying to get better. And the only way I'm going to do that is by finding people who will truthfully and honestly critique things for me. The thing I hate is when somebody sends something back and go, "Oh, that's brilliant, Fergus," and that's the end of it. It's not.
Sure.
There's find something wrong with it, and so that you can keep improving it. And that's why I love the phrase "publish and be damned," because you put it out there and you want criticism. It's the only way you're going to get better. And I think we need more of it. We all have egos. There are times when you don't want to be criticized, but that's the only way that you're going to truly test concepts, theories, hypotheses.
Yeah, and Anthony, I think the question that you're getting at is what makes the scientific process rigorous if you're trying to explore some kind of a phenomenon is, all right, we're taking one thing, comparing it to something else, and everything is the same, but for that one, say, intervention. and then we generate some kind of a conclusion based on, the findings. But that's not necessarily how things work in the real world, because the real world is all about interactions. And a good controlled study, in order for it to be rigorous, is trying to minimize interactive effects. And that's why, you mentioned the idea of a hypothesis. Like generating a hypothesis is necessarily a very kind of like reductionist method of looking at things, because you want to eliminate the effect of confounding variables. But how we coach, right, in practice is like, we have 1,000 things going on and we're tinkering and we're just changing maybe one thing. And that changing that one thing might change the interaction between the other 999 things.
Yep.
So those interactive effects are important. But then again, because it's not that necessarily like a rigorous setting, how do we generate conclusions versus saying, well, like we changed something, we know something happened, but you can't generate as strong a conclusion as you could from a controlled trial. So that's why, I think you need both. I think you need to have kind of like reductionist science, you need to have coaching, and there needs to be communication between those two things. And I think coaches need to understand research, but also researchers need to understand coaching, because they're two different worlds. And I think they can both benefit from one another if they're open-minded.
Great feedback. I want to get a little bit more granular in its application, and one of you guys can tackle this. We talked about science in general. What's sports science? How do we use this to make decisions for team environments for our athletes? I know it might be piggybacked on some of this information, but what is sports science in your words?
Fergus wrote a book on it, so I'll let him go first. Yeah.
Oh man, I honestly don't have an answer. Like, you mean, if from an academic perspective, as Doug mentioned, there's incredible value in having this lab-based reductionist approach to be able to test singular elements or variables within a puzzle or problem that you're trying to solve, because you get to see minute or direct changes. But then when you bring it into the real world, you have to consider all of these other variables. And so for me, starting as a sports scientist and working sports scientist in professional teams primarily, it was a rude awakening for me, realizing, okay, this is the best approach, but you bring it into the team environment, it's never going to work, or I have to adapt it and change. And so understanding that was a very big, quick learning curve for me. One thing, though, that there's a limitation with academic research that sometimes you can only appreciate when you talk to the researcher themselves, because when they publish something or they write something, they're limited in what they can write, because it has to be an absolute conclusion, or it has to, in order to be valid. But when you sit down with the researcher, they've got so many more insights and ideas and rationale and reasoning. I think this is why it happened, but we didn't have proof. That's incredibly valuable. And when you come back to the team sport environment and you try and apply it, you have to make it work. And I think having a relationship between academic science, but also having a gap between both, so that they can respect and the value that both bring, so that you can contribute towards the winning of a team. And I think that one of the challenges, one of the things that I've struggled with, and I've criticized it, is the fact that a sports science seems to be primarily applied to the physical attributes of our athletes, when there's so many other areas. There's coaching science, there's so many other areas that it should be a more integrated approach. That's why I've tried to use the term performance science more often now, because
Yes.
to try and encourage the sports scientists to look beyond just measuring physiological markers.
Well put.
Yeah. And I think before I get into what I think people mean by sports science, I want to go back to Anthony's previous question, where he said, what are some of the limitations of the scientific method? Because I think it ties in nicely with what we kind of mean by sports science. And that's, if you think something is important to measure, right? You've got something you care about. Well, is the thing that you're measuring actually reflective of the thing you care about? That's not necessarily always the case, because Fergus brought up, like, a lot of the sports science research tends to be focused on like physiological attributes. So a great example is VO2 max, right? Like, if you do some kind of an intervention and determine that someone's VO2 max improves, everyone's like, well, that's great, but you don't actually care about VO2 max necessarily. VO2 max is a proxy for aerobic performance, but no one's getting gold medals in the Olympics after 26.2 miles because they had the highest VO2 max. You have to have a sufficiently high VO2 max to be an elite endurance athlete. But the thing, at least like a marathoner actually cares about is, do I run 26.2 miles faster than everybody else? So a lot of times the things that we measure are correlates for the thing that we actually care about, because the thing that we care about, performance, is much harder to objectively quantify.
Start from the scoreboard and work backwards, as Fergus would say, right?
There's that. And then can we actually even measure the thing that we care about? Assuming that we can operationally define it and determine a good proxy or measure it directly, can we measure it? And that's where there's this intersection between now technology and science and technology and sports science, where I think that a lot of times sports science has become synonymous with technology. It's like, well, we do sports science, we like buy technology to measure stuff, but like, are you measuring something because it actually is meaningful to you, or are you measuring it because now there's technology to do it and you're just kind of going fishing? And like Fergus and I talked about this years ago on a podcast that we did. So I think that what sports science, I think the intent of it is, it's really just good systematic coaching, data-driven coaching. It's really what should have been going on all the time, right? But now that we have, academic disciplines devoted to it and we have better technology to measure things, it's really like, are we doing data-driven, data-informed coaching, which I think good coaches have always been doing that. But again, it's like, do you have some kind of a way to audit your coaching besides, well, this is what I see with my eyes? And that can be a lot of things. It can be having a sports science, department. It can be just a coach having some kind of an objective way to collect and analyze data outside of their perception, right? There's always a perceptual element, but outside of like, this is what I've always seen and what I've always done. So I think sports science really is just data-driven coaching. It's just good coaching. It's what we always should do. But, there's also like bureaucracy behind this. I mean, I was in the military. Like when you say that sports science is important, now you can get a greater, but here's where politics comes in. Now you can justify, a couple $100,000 more a year in your budget because you've got to hire for certain positions and get more technology. So,
sure.
But it's really like, it shouldn't be a new thing. It's kind of like what we always should have been doing, but now we're just, we've got more of a formal process for it.
Can I there's some brilliant points there. One of the ones that Doug mentioned is I can only speak from a team sport perspective. There are so many variables. It's so difficult to prove who's actually making an impact or what is important. And the second point that is critical is, today now we tend to approach the challenge of improving team sports with the technology in hand, rather than asking, first of all, and spending sufficient time identifying what the problem is first that we want to address, and then deciding, then looking at, going into the store, so to speak, and looking for the tool to fix it. Like, if one of your taps is leaking, you don't go into the store, buy everything, come home, and then start playing around with it. You go and figure out, okay, where is it leaking? What's the problem? And then go in and take one tool back. And so I think I try to be as positive as I can about this, because it's too easy to be critical. But I do think that, more and more teams are recognizing, okay, we need to start, first of all, with proper problem identification. The point to add on to that is, that's not solely the role of the sports scientist. You need the coaches involved, you need the staff involved to help you identify exactly what that problem is, because it's a multifaceted challenge.
Yeah, great points. I think looking at it from a schema, you have a problem, you start with a problem, you have a temporary theory, you have error eliminators, which again, you can use your technology for, you don't have to. Maybe you have the coach's eyes. And then inadvertently, you have another problem that seems to come back, right? Science starts and ends with problems. So all very interesting. I want to pivot here for a little bit, and I want to get into a related topic, which is critical thinking, right? Fergus, you and I have spoken about this at length in the past, and I can speak from my own experience here. In undergrad, I wasn't taught to critically think. towards my my post grad work at PhD, I learned by process of my mentor this idea of critical thinking, this rationalistic approach. Is this something that you guys think can be taught? Is it something that you think that we can teach in a traditional exercise science class, or is this something that takes place through experience or complete total subject difference? Meaning maybe it's philosophy, maybe it's business leadership. But is this something that we're lacking right now in terms and measures of thinking critically, using that scientific mindset, if you will?
Doug, take this one.
I think you have to believe the answer is yes, right? The question is, how do you do it? I mean, there's a long view of looking at this and a shorter view. I mean, the longer view is, if you just say, okay, like whatever, someone's an undergraduate or in a graduate program, and now we're going to like teach them, we're going to do like a critical thinking class. I suppose you could have that. And if it's done well, it would be helpful. But what about your education from the time that you went from kindergarten through college, right? I mean, this is something that should be kind of cultivated throughout one's education. And I think that, typically the educational approach is more about just regurgitating information. And especially now that we can look up information, I mean, in 5 seconds on one of these, like, or recall a fact, how important is that memory recall? And in reality, like anything that you really remember, you never deliberately, I don't want to say never, but for the most part, you didn't deliberately say like, okay, I'm going to try to memorize something. If something is important, you're just exposed to it enough times and it's meaningful enough and there's an emotional connection that you kind of remember it without consciously trying to memorize it, like a song, right? Mm-hmm. Like we can all recite lyrics to a song. We never were like, okay, I'm going to print out the lyrics for the song and memorize it. It just kind of happens, like learning a language, right? Like how we learn a foreign language in school is much different than how we learn our first language through immersion and things that are like basically like, if you didn't learn a language when you were young, you wouldn't be able to communicate. So there's a lot of incentives, skin in the game. So I think that, we could do a better job earlier on at just de-emphasizing memory recall, something that's important, versus how to look at things, how to dissect problems. I think humility is really important too, because like the conversation that we're having now is really about like, these things are important, but we don't actually know that much about it. And none of us can say, well, here's a perfect way to define science, to construct a sports science program. It's very messy. One of my favorite articles on the subject, I reference it a lot, is from Russ Roberts. What do economists actually know? People think of economics as a very concrete field because we're using numbers, and so the number at the end tells a story. But those numbers and those models are based on assumptions upon quantitative, like economics or math. We need our assumptions, and how can we plug holes in this model? Because the model is based on a series of assumptions which are based on certain values, because the first assumption is based on, well, what do you value? And then it kind of trickles down from there. I think that's where even like people think that philosophy is not a practical field, but I think that philosophy should be taught in schools, because if you interact with somebody with a philosophy background, they tend to have a lot of intellectual humility, because if they say, okay, well, I'm gonna talk about like Rawls today and I'm gonna be a Rawlsian. Well, if you're a pure Rawlsian, there's someone that can find holes in your argument. And philosophy is all about like, how do you find holes in one's logic? And I think it tends to lead to some humility. So I think we need to emphasize philosophy earlier on, and then you can have courses in quote unquote like critical thinking, but that should be cultivated throughout one's education. And that's where I think having a multidisciplinary approach to education is important too, because if you only look at things through one lens, like that's a particular bias, right? If you look at history as like, okay, we're going to teach history as a series of facts and events, versus, well, history is actually the influence of politics and economics on world events. And now we need to have the bucket approach at some point to make things more manageable. But if all you do is look at things in terms of each lens or each bucket, and Sapolsky talks about this a lot, like you can watch Sapolsky's human behavioral biology course from Stanford for free on YouTube. That's his first lecture, is like, yes, biology is taught in buckets. We have like endocrinology, physiology, molecular biology, but it makes things easier to learn, but that's not what we actually care about, and how we truly make meaningful statements about how the world works. So I think there needs to be a little bit more integration and less reductionism. And I think that right now that the approach tends to be very, very sort of memory recall driven and very, individual subject driven.
Excellent point, and it's interesting you mentioned Russ Roberts. You of all people turned me on to the Econ Talk podcast. Unbelievable podcast.
The best, yeah.
And the crazy part is it has nothing to do with strength training or performance training, but it has everything to do with performance training.
Yeah, totally.
It has to deal with making decisions under uncertainty. Several of the interviewees that I found quite interesting in terms, one, Gerd Gigerenzer, gut feelings. He talked about making decisions in uncertainty, and metric fixation, because we're dealing with uncertainty, just like the economy, just like we do in sports science. So it's interesting. A lot of those resources that I turn to my critical thinking to nurture that part of my brain, I know, again, have nothing to do, but everything to do with performance training. Interesting. Fergus, anything to add?
Oh yeah, like I mean, there's so many directions you can take that. Like first of all, one point or one thought that came to me, when you talk about science and certainty, and you carry that over into sport, there's then this assumption that the data that's collected is accurate or is the truth when it's not. Again, there's so many issues with it before it's even collected. But then once it's presented, oh, well, then it must be true, it must be accurate, we follow it. On the critical thinking side, I have an issue with just the education. I refer to it now as an educational industry, because it now has become a system or a process by which we just push people through. We encourage belief. We encourage people to believe in something that we're going to present to them, not to think about it, not to have discussions about it. We don't, whether it's mathematics, whether it's history, whether it's English, by encouraging people to think critically, to debate, to be creative with it, we encourage better learning, but we also encourage them then later on to be able to interpret information and to continue to learn in that subject. The role of, if you're teaching a subject or a topic, your job is to teach someone how to continue to learn in that. So whether it's learning a language, learning history, how they can go forward when you are not there and continue to learn about it. You can't do that if it's simply rote learning. So we're not encouraging people to continue to progress in the area, and so much of what we do today is based around rote learning. So if you fail an exam, it's because you just didn't remember what it was you were supposed to recall in the exam. We don't encourage failure. We don't encourage the learning process post-failure, how people can overcome things, how people continue to learn. And then, the other point that Doug mentioned as well was the ability to collaborate or to pull different concepts together and combine them and create a synergy between different subjects. And so what you have now today is, if you take the high school process, then into university, and you just continue that on. One of the really interesting changes I think that has happened from a societal perspective is, if you go back to the 60s and 70s in particular, those were incredible hubs of social discourse. There were many incredible leaders, thought leaders came from universities. They were incubators for ideas. I don't think you can quite say that in the same way. Like if you look back at Vietnam, if you look back during when there was a lot of social unrest, there were incredible thought leaders came from those environments. They were very diverse environments, or more diverse perhaps then in terms of thinking and ideas. And so I think we're missing out on that. I think that we don't, particularly from when you look at society today. I think it also has a huge impact, if you want to get very political, when you look at the First Amendment. One of the reasons that you have that is to allow people to take up perspectives and argue them, and trust that the people who are listening to these ideas will be able to think critically and come to their own conclusion. So you've got two sides. Do you decide to restrict freedom of speech, or do you encourage it? But if you encourage it, you have to ensure that people are going to be able to, and rightly so, debate and come to the right conclusion. There's incredible value in having critics. You need critics. You need freedom of the press. Otherwise you just end up with a dictatorship where you're just going to be fed things. So you need to respect these things and encourage them.
Yeah, and Anthony, I love what you said about how Econ Talk has nothing to do with coaching, but everything to do with it. And that's where I think, reading outside of one's field can be very important, is because every field, to kind of validate its existence, invents its own language, its own constructs, so that, you you've got to justify the cost of your PhD or your medical degree. So we kind of like, we spend, 4 years after undergrad, basically creating a new language that only we can speak internally. So we can, again, kind of make ourselves feel important. And you need to have specific knowledge, but fundamentally, for the most part, across disciplines, like different disciplines are fundamentally trying to solve the same problems. If you really break it down into philosophically things like communication, cost benefit analysis, uncertainty, every field deals with that. So if you read outside your field and you get outside of like your own myopia and your own language that you obsess over, it can almost allow you to broaden your perspective and say, oh wow, like I'm listening to. And what I love about Econ Talk is the guests are so interesting. When you read kind of like, okay, I've got so and so who's going to talk about this topic. It might seem like a very uninteresting topic on the surface, but then when they break down, well, here are the fundamental ideas that I'm grappling with. You're like, oh, that's actually the same things that I'm thinking about as a coach or a medical provider. So when you kind of get outside your own internal language, you can actually then zoom back into the things that you do in your own field and have a much, I think, better filter through which to look at information. So, and that's kind of the tricky part about how to navigate this whole thing. It's like David Epstein range, right? Like you have to have specific knowledge. The question is, how much specific knowledge do you need before you need to zoom out and broaden your perspective? And so I know, I mean, for me, I'm at the point now where like, I don't have a systematic way of doing it. Like when I get bored of reading about, physical therapy or strength and conditioning things, I read more philosophical and history things. And when I get sick of that, I'll zoom in and I'll zoom out. And I try to be honest with myself and audit like where my weaknesses are. And I just do things that I enjoy at this point, but you need to be zooming in and zooming out. I don't know if there's like an algorithm that tells you how much of one thing you need versus the other, but I think again, the educational approach tends to focus on specialization as if like every field is so unique when we're not that unique. I mean, and even that's why like the COVID situation is, infectious disease is only one component of that. So having a disease model, like here's the receptors that COVID attacks, here are the medications. Well, that's one piece of it because it's really about risk mitigation. How do you balance the effects of, a pandemic with the economic impact and the mental health impact? And, again, those things are so multidisciplinary. You're never going to have one field that has a monopoly on how to tackle that kind of problem, which is why I think, anybody can have very profound insight into how to tackle that problem, regardless of their field. That's why I hate the saying like, well, stay in your lane, because like for something like COVID or sports science, like whose lane is it? Who's the bus driver that can monopolize a very multifaceted problem, a complex domain like that? Nobody can. So stay in your lane. Like anytime I hear somebody say stay in your lane, it's like, well, you've lost me. Like I kind of lose respect for that person, because the things that really matter, there are no lanes. It's a very messy, intersecting, thing that if you looked at it on a PowerPoint slide, which I'm not competent enough at PowerPoint to do that, it would be like this unfolding, helix structure with all these different directions and pathways, but there are no lanes when it comes to this stuff.
So true. Another great book, The Neo Generalist, talks about this concept. They say dragonfly vision, as opposed to he calls it being a serial specialist. And the analogy I like to use in the performance landscape is, if you spend all day just making something, I'm just, all about force plates, you keep digging and digging a hole. And the next thing you look up and you lose track of the landscape. And the landscape is very, very vast. It's extensive. So this idea of being a serial specialist, being smart, knowing multiple domains and having competence in each, I thought it was really, really important. Speaking of a guest on Econ Talk, I want to give an analogy and ask a question. When do we stray from quote unquote science? We have art and science, right? Coaching is art and science. Specifically, the role of heuristics. I want to give you guys an analogy that I like to use with Gerd Gigerenzer in his book Risk Savvy. He said we have three worlds. We have a world of certainty, which doesn't exist. We have a world of probability where we play games, blackjack, whatever it may be. And we have a world of uncertainty where we don't know what happens. Physiology, coaching lives in that world of uncertainty. And Gerd would argue that in those worlds, simple heuristics can do worlds of wonder. Gut feelings, following your gut, creating those heuristics. Now, heuristics they don't come overnight. they come from years and years of experience. And I would imagine that as coaches, of course, especially skill coaches, whether you're a head coach, we don't have the ability to look back at the data. You have to make decisions quickly. Thoughts on heuristics? I know that's kind of a loaded question. I know there's a lot to bite off and to chew on. But thoughts on heuristics, thoughts on this world of uncertainty in which we live in, and when to use them, when not to use them, perhaps as performance coaches or strength and conditioning coaches?
From the moment you're born, you're focused on survival. And as a result, you're looking for certainty, you're looking for security so that you can survive and do that. And that's a fundamental human need. In order to survive, we desire some kind of security. We look for certainty. Now we look for metrics. Now we look, and this drive continues through. And it's a fundamental theme in sports science. And I think acknowledging the fact that we will never have certainty, we're not able to predict, we operate and we make decisions based on probability. That's the first agreement that you have to make with yourself. Now, following on from that, you have to see the value and appreciate the value of, like you say, gut feeling and what that is, and emotions and affect, and understanding how we make decisions. I used to have this conversation with a head coach all the time. I would present data. He would say, "Oh, what should we do?" And I would say, "Okay, this is what the data is suggesting, but you have to add on top of that your 40 years of playing the game, coaching the game, because there is intangible knowledge, intuition that you can add to this. These are just signposts, but you have to place value on that." And I think we've now got to this stage where we are looking for certainty, we're looking for data, we're looking for testing, which is, we've already outlined, can be wildly inaccurate or misleading at best. And you have to balance both. That's why, for me, what you create in a sporting team is a decision support system. You provide methods and processes to provide data that support or argue against the decision you're going to make. And you have to add in intuition. You have to add in experience and place value on that, because there are so many decisions that we make, rightly so, which are essentially heuristics. There's some valid data, and then there's some perception, because our brain is a prediction system. Every time you make a step, you're predicting, okay, what's the depth of this step or whatever. But it's appreciating that not everything is a formula. And I think once we acknowledge that, then we can put sports science, data, metrics, or, to use the word Doug used, these proxies, because you're not actually measuring it. You've got a number that reflects something that you think might be. A few years, you'll find out it wasn't quite accurate or whatever. So that's how you make decisions. It's a decision support system in a sporting environment.
The point about survival, I think, is important, because a heuristic is just an epistemological shortcut. And when survival is at stake, speed is more important than optimization, right? And like, we're here to survive. We're not necessarily here to optimize. So, whatever, 5,000 years ago, if you're walking through the woods and you see a purple mushroom, and like, your ancestors have told you that people have died from eating purple mushrooms. Well, like, the downside of you eating that purple mushroom is way higher than the upside of you possibly eating it and not getting sick, because there's plenty of other food to eat, right? So that's why even some biases and prejudices can have a survival benefit, because we're not, like, again, designed to be optimal systems. So I think heuristics serve a very important purpose. And, kind of my journey with this was, at one point I read Thinking Fast and Slow. When you read that, your conclusion is like, well, we're all dumb, we're all idiots, like, how did we even survive? But then you read Gerd, and having read both, Gerd resonates with me more, because when I read Thinking Fast and Slow, it's like, well, who is the arbiter of what is good? It's like, I appreciate psychology as a field, but like, even like a psychologist who creates an IQ test, like, so a human being decides, well, this is a test of your intelligence. A human being had to write that. It's not like a divine being came down and said, here's an intelligence test that's detached from, so somebody had to write the test. And it's like, well, so because you wrote the test and wrote the answers, does that make you the smartest person, right? So who is the arbiter of what kind of critical thinking is and good thinking? Whereas, like, at least with heuristics and kind of the Gerd model, it's like, things that survive, maybe in isolation, like not a particular phenomenon might not be like evidence-based or optimal, but it's the totality of the human being, the totality of the society, of the tribe. Like if that tribe survives, then that's why even something like religion, right? People can say, oh, well, like religion is not rational, but religion is one part of a greater ecosystem. So you can't necessarily say, well, we're going to get rid of the irrational things and then only sprinkle in rational things and have this optimal system, because that's not how things work in the real world. So yeah, like, and then you get into things like skin in the game from Taleb, right?
Yep.
Where I think he takes kind of a more of a GERD approach. Like you have to look at things that survive, and then you can try to deconstruct, well, why did they survive? But not every aspect of a behavior or a person that survived needs to be optimal. And I think that we're overly obsessed with optimization. I think, the scientific process is that, the goal is optimization, but like in a COVID world, there's no optimal strategy because there's always a trade-off. And those trade-offs, the relative weight of those trade-offs is contingent upon values and ethics and things that you care about. So that's why, like, we have this conversation, and it almost leads to nihilism, where you're like, well, I don't know what to think. Nothing matters. Everything is so complex. So ultimately, I think at least for me, I would say, like, you can look at what I do. If we're talking about like how do you rehab somebody, I'll show you the program that I wrote. And that's all we can really. That's the most intellectually honest thing that we can do, is just say, here's what I did in this situation, because everything else is theoretical, right? But when your ass is on the line, like, what did you do with this person? And then I can try to explain, well, here's why I think that I did it. But not every decision that I make involves this very intricate. I use heuristics and shortcuts, and sometimes I do things without even conscious thought. But at a minimum, I can show you, here's what I did. Taleb says in Skin in the Game, show me your portfolio. Like, I don't care what your model is. It's like, and he references, or I think Bird does, in Risk Savvy, there was the economist who won the Nobel Prize for his investment model.
Absolutely.
When they asked him, do you actually use it? He's like, no, I just basically I do 1/n. I find like the S&P 500 and I equally invest in all those things. And he basically just tries to perform to market level. And a lot of my patients are, finance people and professional investors. And I ask them, I'm like, what do you do with your own money? And most of them do the 1/n strategy. And the ones that don't do it, I'm like, well, why don't you just, do index funds, invest in the S&P? And they're like, well, I probably should, but I think that I'm too smart. And I think that I'm smarter than the market. And most people that professionals that people pay for investment advice, a lot of them don't outperform the market. So the 1/n thing, that's a pretty good heuristic. And if you're going to beat that, you've got to be really, really good. And a lot of people don't it's hard to do that.
We actually use that heuristic programming, of all things. It was from Taleb, and we also from GERD. I mean, we dose our stress differently. The gain, go, grow. That heuristic is a byproduct of we put it into use. The interesting part too, when you look back at it from at least how GERD would talk about using heuristics, it's easy to look back in hindsight where we have all the data, and you can be much more complicated in your algorithms, et cetera. He said, the difficult part and what you have on your side at that point is no uncertainty. Something's been done. But the future, predicting, if there is such a word, should be much more simple. Making it more complex, essentially, you could be taking and extracting a lot of noise and no signal and producing, these fancy queries that 3/4 of it are noise, and as a consequence of which you're losing out. So try to keep things as simple as possible. As Dan Pfaff would say, have 3 to 5 anchor points that you can come back to regularly based on the importance of the sport, the biomechanics, the bioenergetics. Don't overburden yourself with quote unquote metrics, and keep things simple. Have heuristics, use them, but also relate back to your science and your decision making as well. So I think it's not one or the other. I think using both really help enrich decision making.
On those anchor points as well, like you're holding them lightly.
Yeah.
Because at any point you're going to go, hey, you know what? Actually, this one needs to change because it's obvious. But it brings you back around to the question I was asked by a student a few months ago. Should you ever do anything that there isn't research for? That's the stage that some people have gotten to. Oh, well, I think this is a common sense approach, but I need to check and see, has this been done in the research first before I can apply it? And that's almost worrying for me in the sense that, if you see something that, and there's a whole value and an ethical and moral thing here, first of all, but knowing that you're not going to do any harm, it shouldn't be a case that you have to go and check and find 4 or 5 research papers that prove, am I going to make this basic intervention? And I think that's one of the things that can restrict, younger people coming through in the industry.
Excellent points. Guys, one final question here before we round out this hour. From a performance perspective, what is your hierarchical approach regarding the science? I'll give you an example. Do we, as coaches, look at our unique sample size? From there, do we look at randomized controls? From there, do we have observational? Like, what's a hierarchical order for you when you try to look through the lens of making decisions? Does that question make sense, gentlemen?
Mm-hmm.
Doug, you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, again, I can only speak for what I do and how I look at things. I'm not saying it's the right answer, but honestly, I have, colleagues and people in the field that I trust and respect, people like you guys. And if I'm struggling with something, I just try to find other humans who I think, think critically to call me on my own bullshit, because these people are, presumably consumers of science, but they're also multidisciplinary thinkers. And I rely on people to audit my thinking. I mean, I'll read the occasional research study, but like, I'm not going to lie. Like I look at a lot of these research studies and the formatting is so unreadable. Like that, I would frankly rather listen to a podcast of the researcher summarizing the research and getting to the things that are really meaningful to me, because a lot of the research process is the formality of like, how do you get a study approved? And I read a study for like one piece of information. I don't care about a lot of the formality that, it's required to get something published. So for me, it's just surrounding myself with the right people who are intellectually honest and that are going to call me out if I'm wrong. And I think that's why, like, in the climate that we're in now, where if you don't like what somebody has to say, you're like, well, you should shut them down. I mean, that is the most antithetical thing to science that there is. Like, if what the only takeaway is, like, the biggest takeaway for me is whatever you want to call it, science, epistemology, it's fundamentally a human-driven process. And if you shut down conversation, especially people who are trying to converse in good faith, well, then there's no way to. And that was the conclusion of the article that I wrote that you referenced in the beginning, was like, once we stop talking and stop communicating, like now we've dug put a tombstone in science. So I think it's just conversation and surrounding yourself with the right people who, are kind of applying some of the things that we've talked about over the last hour.
Excellent.
I'd start with experience. If I've got a problem, a challenge, I'd start with experience. What have I done before? What has worked? And then, like Doug, I'd reach out to people that are respecting the industry, or people who I think have addressed this problem before. Who do they know? And I'll check through the research to see, has something recently been done that either supports or dismisses what I'm going to do, and approach it in the most critical way that I can. I don't know where or when, I realized it, but there's nothing that you do that you can be absolutely certain about, because there's so many things that you're learning. And I think having that respect, not cautiousness, but respect for what you're doing, I think is critical. But first and foremost, doing it in good faith, as Doug said, morally and ethically, and making those decisions, I think, is paramount. And being able to communicate with people who are solving problems in that way, I think that's the most important thing. I have no problem with somebody who has a completely different perspective. I actually enjoy that, because it makes me, whether I agree with them or not, it makes me think more critically about what I'm doing. Where I do have an issue is where somebody knowingly presents something that they know to be untrue or to be inaccurate. And I think that's the only issue, that I have. And there are people who will present something that, to be wrong, but they're doing it in good faith. That's fine. But it's when something's misrepresented, then that's a challenge. And that's a challenge for the industry, I think.
Great. Our guests today have been Fergus Connolly and Doug Kechijian. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us on the podcast.
It's been a pleasure.
Great fun.